Welcome back to Untaming Masculinity, the podcast where we tackle issues relevant to men and their journeys to reclaim their masculinity. I'm your co-host, Dan, and as always, I'm joined by our co-host, Brad. What's going on today, man?
Not much, man. Another day in paradise. What about you?
It's been a busy weekend, but it's good. It's first nice spring, low mid 70s day. So I was out doing some yard work. We're taking an area of the yard and putting down some rock and making a fire pit area. Should be nice.
Are you taking out all the sod?
No, we just put weed blocker on top of it. I talked to one of our old battle team members who's a landscaper, and he kind of gave me some hints. So
that's smart. Sod is a lot of work. Getting sod up is a lot of work.
Yeah,
I had to remove a 6x6 square in our backyard, and it was miserable, horrible.
I did have to move and replant like 2 or 3 hostas. So whatever, that's pretty easy. They're basically resilient weeds. It was good. Nice day outside, though. So today, we've got a pretty interesting topic. What we wanted to discuss was the importance of marriage and how important keeping your marriage relationship is over your relationship with your children.
Oh, man.
So this is going to be an interesting one to jump into. I'll start by saying this. I've made the mistake in the past, my wife and I both have, of prioritizing our kids, and it came at the expense of our marriage. There was definitely the point where we hit a lull in it, and it was only at this point where when we made this realization together that our marriage kind of got back on track. So I think this is a really important one. I think it'll help a lot of guys, and I want to just start by getting your thoughts on, or asking you your history with this and where you kind of stand now.
Oh, man. So this topic, when you brought it up to me, was one where it was one of the first topics I realized this is an area of my life where I've historically sucked. So it's a good one to talk about. I think about my relationship with my wife, and as we've talked about, I haven't had the best marriage. It's improving. So much of that marriage, so much of the strife and issues stemmed from me, because I didn't prioritize her. So because I didn't prioritize my wife, sometimes she felt and even told me that my daughter was the most important person in my world. And it made me realize that it wasn't possible for me to be a good husband and, importantly, a good father if I couldn't put my wife first and take care of her. One of the things that's really kind of resonated with me is our kids watch how we treat our spouses. Our kids watch how we treat our wives. And they want us to have happy marriages. Every kid wants their parents to have a good marriage. And when I've fallen short in that area, I've almost even been approached by my daughter saying, "Hey, what's wrong with you and mom?" And things like that really stick with me. So I would say over the last year or so, I've made a tremendous effort on trying to rekindle having a great relationship with my wife and prioritizing her. But at the same time, I also realize I'm not an expert at it yet. It's definitely a work in progress. I know by that same token, I kind of look at you and the marriage you have with your wife, and I find that to be something very admirable. So I guess kicking that back to you, where do you think you stand with this one?
I appreciate that. And it's, much like you, it's a lot of hard work. We're just further down the road. I'm one of those lucky guys who married a girl who I was really good friends with. It's everyone kind of says that, whatever, but I really feel like my wife and I, we get along real well. We're very similar in thoughts. It's not, it wasn't one of those things where it was this passionate thing in the beginning and then it just kind of fizzled out. Like we've stayed really good friends. But when we had kids, as with every marriage, things changed. And we have twins, so it was kind of, we just jumped in with both feet and nobody knew what was going on kind of thing, which happens to everybody. We just had it in stereo.
Oh, yeah.
But, when we first had kids, I would say the first 2 years, we were more roommates than partners. We had our routines. The kids were there. She was much more involved in their day-to-day activity and their day-to-day life than I was. She was managing. Because my wife was working, we had a nanny who came in and stayed most of the days until they were, I think, 3 or 4, and then we put them in daycare for the day. But she was controlling that, she was managing that, and I was just kind of bringing the money, handling things, and I was not really paying attention to my marriage. I was trying to have a relationship with my kids, and I was failing on all fronts. And we hit a dark spot. It wasn't terrible, but it was a dark spot for us. Probably around the time they were 4, and it was just crappy. Like, we weren't getting along. We were fighting all the time. The kids even said, I can remember my daughter coming up to me, at 4 years old, saying, why do you and mommy yell at each other so much? And that was kind of a turning point for me. I'm like, all right, there's something wrong here. We need to take care of this. And I read somewhere or heard somewhere this concept of prioritizing your wife over your kids. And at first I thought it was complete horseshit because they're my kids, right? You know what I mean? I brought these little people into the world. How can you tell me that I'm not supposed to prioritize them? But the more I listened to the thought and rolled it around my head, it made a lot of sense. And there's a lot of couple like talking points that we'll get to on this topic, but the one that sticks with me the most is she was there before the kids, and she's going to be there after the kids, or at least in an ideal world, she's going to be there after the kids, right? And you want her there after the kids. So you got to take care of that relationship while the kids are there.
Yeah. I think one thing that's really easy to, when you gets lost in the shuffle when you're raising kids, it's like you said, there's a lot to it. I mean, once you introduce a kid into the equation, they require a lot of attention. I mean, that's just how it is. And with that, you have to think when you marry your wife, you don't necessarily, I mean, let's hope you don't marry her with the intention of someday getting a divorce.
Right.
I don't think anybody goes into a marriage thinking, oh man, that's going to fizzle out in 10 years. I think most men, as they should, when they walk across the aisle, they look at that wife, they think, I want to be with this woman forever, or to the day she dies, or whatever that looks like. You have to think that raising your children is such a small window in the overall picture of a marriage. You think of your grandparents, my grandparents who were married for 50 some odd years before they passed on. They raised 4 kids. And those kids might have taken up a total of 25 years of that marriage and before they all moved out and went on their own. So just like you said, your wife, that's the woman you fell in love with. That's the woman that you wooed and you felt all Twitter-pated for, whatever terminology you want to use. And when you married her, you set out thinking, this woman's my world and my priority. A lot of times, as hard as it might be to say, we allow the introduction of a child to take away from that. And I would ask you, do you think that is representative of the commitments that you make to a woman when you walk across the aisle and commit to her in the bonds of marriage, that you're going to deprioritize her for somebody else? And I'd say no.
No, I don't think it's, it is indicative of that. I look at it this way, right? You're young when you get married, right? Most people are in their 20s, mid to late 20s. You're still kids at that point, whether you realize it or not. And you don't know what you don't know. You've got this wide-eyed view of what the world's going to be like, and everything's unicorns and rainbows, and you found this beautiful, awesome woman who you're going to spend the rest of your life with. And the thought of having kids is a great idea. I want kids, I want a house, I want all this stuff. And then you actually have kids, and you realize how much work it is. And how much work the wife typically takes upon herself once the kids come in. Because let's face it, women in general have that nurturing mindset, that mothering mindset. And I know it was the case for me. I felt left out once my kids showed up. And I reacted like a child and said, well, if you're not going to pay attention to me, I'm not going to pay attention to you. I don't know if that was a conscious decision. I don't remember consciously having that thought, but looking back on my actions and looking back on the way things were, that's exactly how I reacted.
If you think about that, it kind of makes sense though, right? I mean, in a very selfish perspective, you're going from, hey, here's this woman who dotes on you.
You're the center of her world.
Great relationship.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then that's taken away from you. And it's not that you don't love your kids and you don't love that dynamic, but a woman has to pour everything she has into newborns, and considering you had to go through 2 at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. There's not a lot of time or energy left for you.
Right.
The important point here too, right, is you said something about when you have kids and it's not about not loving your kids. That's absolutely true. We're in no way, shape, or form here saying you shouldn't love your kids. You shouldn't be a great father. You should. It just should not come at the expense of your marriage and the relationship with your wife. That's a very important point to make crystal clear in this conversation. You can
Yeah.
have both, but you need to prioritize that relationship with your wife as well. And you need to make sure that that relationship is lockstep first before any relationship with your child or your children.
Yeah.
And it's to the benefit of your children too, right? Because to your point, you're raising kids and they're looking at you and your wife as this picture of what a marriage should be. Now, do you want to show them a couple who values each other and dotes on each other, and not dotes, but takes care of each other and is responsible to each other, or do you want to show a couple that's always bickering, that is prioritizing everything but that relationship? I don't think so. You asked me before, where am I at now? And I mentioned I was further down the road. Well, a month or two ago, we were sitting at dinner and we were all joking around, and I was giving my wife a hard time and she was giving me a hard time back, but we were all smiles and laughs. And my daughter, just out of the blue, looks at me and she goes, I want to have a husband like Dad because you and Dad have a good time together. When that was like, I'm like, all right, I have been able to, or we have been able to bring this thing full circle now. And that was such, like, I looked at her and I just stopped everything I was doing. I was like, you have no idea how much that means to me.
That's rad, man. That's really cool. And that's something that I think is easy to forget on, or to forget about, is this prioritization of kids and what kind of effect that has on your wife. Because much like you said in that example of, you know what, you're going to pay attention to the kids, screw you, I'm not going to focus on you. Subconsciously, I did the same thing at some point in my marriage. And the transition of love and affection went from my wife to, at first, my daughter, because she came first, and to my son. And it was one of those things that I would realize when my wife and I would sit down and talk. And I think I may have mentioned here, we saw a therapist for a while, and a conversation piece that came out was, you always put our daughter first. When you come home from work, who's the first person you talk to? It's our daughter. It's not our son. It's not me. It's her. You don't care about how I'm doing. You care about how she's doing. These are conversations I had to have with my wife, and they were gut punch, thinking, of course I love my daughter. I love my daughter tremendously, and I always will. But it made me realize a couple of things. One, my priorities were out of whack. Because if my wife is sitting here thinking, I don't care about how she feels, I care about my daughter, or I don't care about how my son feels, it felt horrible to hear something like that. But that was her perspective of the situation, and I couldn't be dismissive of that. So, to your point, by prioritizing my kids, or in this case, just using an example of my daughter, I don't want anybody to think I love my daughter more than my son or my wife or anything, but she was able to recognize that that's were things that I was doing. I realized I had to change. I had to do something different. So that meant prioritizing her and her needs. What were ways that I could serve her? What were ways that I could rebuild my relationship with my wife? Because much like you said, there was a point where we would fight a lot. We couldn't have conversations that were much more than transactional. Rebuilding that. And that started with really genuinely caring about how my wife was doing. And when I came home, she stays at home. She's a stay-at-home mom. Mm-hmm. Asking her how her day was, how things are going, how she survived the day with our son, who is awesome, but he can also be a little wild guy. And just the act of helping her feel important has gone such a tremendous way in, one, helping get our marriage back on track. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I have this down perfectly, but it's something that I've made an effort toward building, and I've seen the benefit. And two, most importantly, my kids know that their mom is incredibly important to me. And that because their mom is incredibly important to me, they can look at us and see, one, much like you said with your daughter, this is what a marriage should look like. And two, someday when I get older, I need to look at somebody who is going to treat me with that level of respect and love as well.
So it's simply put, right, by prioritizing your kids, or your daughter specifically in your instance, you're deprioritizing your marriage. Right? You can't prioritize both equally. You have to pick one that is the most important. It's not to say your daughter is not very, very important to you. but the marriage has to be that top priority to make everything else work.
Yeah.
The interesting thing too, right, is, we talked about how we're these role models as parents on what a marriage should look like and whatnot. It's also important to look at it from a parenting perspective. If you and your wife are in a solid relationship, that means you talk, that means you're intimate, and not the Barry White kind of intimate, but you're really talking about solid issues and getting to the core of things, and talking about your days and the problems and that kind of thing. That means that from a parenting perspective, you're discussing all these issues and you're showing a unified front. So now little Susie isn't playing daddy off mommy. Daddy isn't just the good guy who buys them candy and brings them to the park when mommy has to be the disciplinarian, or vice versa, whatever it is. You are a unified front, and your children benefit from having that relationship and knowing that this is the playing field. This is what it's going to be, regardless of whether I go to mom or whether I go to dad or whether I go to both of them at the same time. And that's because you and your wife have a solid relationship that is the priority at home.
This is one, oh man, like having that unified front is something that I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I've been amazing at.
It's very hard.
Earlier on in my marriage, I mean, even I still, there are times where I'm kind of I'm the cupcake compared to my wife when it comes to discipline with the kids. If the kids want candy, who's the more likely one to give them candy? It's going to be dad. If the kids want to watch a lot of TV, who's going to be the more likely one to let them watch a lot of TV? It's usually going to be dad. Who's going to be the one that, if they don't want to do all their homework on time, who's going to kind of let them off the hook? It's going to be dad. This is something that my wife and I have had to discuss a lot, that kids are smart. It's not that they're inherently deceptive or manipulative, but they know how to play one parent off of another one. And they figured out pretty quickly that if they wanted something, come to dad. And it really disrupted our marriage. Like, my wife felt as if I were undermining her, because if she's trying to set up rules and habits and rituals and healthy lifestyle choices, that we can't have dad over here disrupting and destroying all of that. So learning to be a unified front was very important. And another thing that was extraordinarily important to me that I really struggled with was essentially painting the picture that it wasn't my decision, that it was my wife's, which is horrible. Like, that's a very, very horrible thing. And she had seen that. So that unified front is vital, and it's critical. And a lot of times it requires a man to swallow his ego, to think, oh, I've got this figured out. I know how to raise kids. I'll tell you one thing. I am a fraction of the parent that my wife is. But at the same time, I need to support her. And most importantly, she needs to know that I'm supporting her in any parenting decision. She needs to know that if the kids want some chocolate, I need to say, hey guys, we're not having chocolate today. If the kids need to do homework or get in bed at a reasonable hour, this is what we do as a family. So that the message is consistent, so that if they ask her or if they ask me, that message is the same. And I will tell you, by the simple act of trying and working to apply those principles and be a unified front, that meant more to my wife than almost anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because she felt respected. If we don't hold up our end of the bargain, that's a lack of respect to our wives. Is that the kind of legacy that we want to leave? I don't think so.
I was smiling while you were talking about this, because it actually reminded me of a lot of the leadership lessons that we talked about with Ian Roth last week, right? And one of the big things I've learned in leadership over my career is that you have to have a unified front to have a strong leadership team. And that's really what you are as parents, is a leadership, part of what you are as parents is a leadership team. So when you're in the workplace and as a middle manager, you come down and say, all right, guys, we have to do X because senior management is dictating this. You have just undermined the value of senior management. You have just told your troops that basically, well, I don't agree with this, but they say we have to do it, so we have to do it. You can do it for a bunch of different reasons. Maybe you want to be buddy with the guys you're leading, whatever. But the same is true in a marriage as it is in the corporate world, in that you can sit there and you can disagree behind closed doors. But once you leave that room, you have to have a unified front. And like you said, it brings value to your wife. It brings value to the senior management at work. It's kind of neat how all these things, interlace. But
Yeah.
From a marriage perspective, if you start to undermine your wife, you're sending the message that I don't care what you think. I'm going to raise these kids the way I want to raise these kids, and screw you for thinking that your ideas are better than mine. And listen, the same is true on their end. The wives absolutely need to be part of this discussion and need to come to middle ground with us too.
Yeah.
The point being that conversation has to take place away from the kids, and it has to be that unified front. That way you're not dealing with, right, well, dad says we get candy and mom says we have to eat our vegetables, so I'm going to dad.
It's fascinating if you think about how dysfunctional conversations can get. How dysfunction can enter the equation to undermine, another parent. I earlier on in my parenting realm, I saw that, and I interestingly, I actually saw it quite a bit growing up with my parents. How my dad would do certain things and my mom would undermine him. I think that was one of those things where I was given. I do not want to suggest that this is any sort of negative. I'm not trying to drag my parents or anything, but I saw countless examples growing up of my dad saying one thing and my mom saying, "Nah, we don't need to do that," or "Let's do something else." There's constant undermining. And it was very interesting to see just how much that affected their marriage for a long time. My parents had a very, very unhealthy marriage for years. They're still together, but it is because they learned and they made the decision of, I need to make sure that I prioritize my wife. I need to make sure that I prioritize my husband over my kids. But they went through years of strife and struggle, and I saw that firsthand. I saw just how much this lack of unity, I guess, if you will, and the overall impact it had on us. And one thing I will tell you is the reason that my mom would do certain things was to make it easy, to not be the bad guy. And I realized I would do those same things with my kids. Is I didn't want to be the bad guy to tell them no. I wanted to be dad. I wanted to have a relationship with them. I wanted them to look and say, "Oh, dad's the best." It's almost as if I wanted to be their friend. And I think that that's one thing that is really easy to look at is we're not friends with our kids. We're their fathers. However, with our relationships with our wives, we're not just in a relationship. She's not just our wife. Ultimately, she should be our friend. So what does that mean is the relationship with a wife is a lot more nuanced and a lot more complicated, if you will, than it is with a kid. And I think that we lose sight of that because we're so narrowly focused on making sure we raise these children and give them a happy life that we think that by being their friend or making things easy on them or by putting them first, that somehow we're going to be a great father. But I don't necessarily know if what I'm trying to say is making a whole lot of sense. But what it boils down to in my mind, I think, is that because we're so focused on trying to be friendly or buddy-buddy with our kids that we're losing sight of what's more important, which is being a father first and foremost, which will therefore allow us to be what we need to be with our wife, which is a partner, a husband, a confidant, all these other attributes that we need to be as men.
What you just said makes a lot of sense to me. I was just listening to it and really trying to take it in because when I was a younger father, and obviously when my kids were younger, I was the opposite of you. I was the disciplinarian. I was the one who was, my kids can't act up. My kids can't, they need to put their stuff away. They need to do this. They need to do that. And my wife had to reel me in and be like, they're kids. Let them be kids at a certain point. Right. And I thought she was too loose. She thought I was too tight. We had to collectively come to a middle ground, and I had to loosen up, which is really hard for me with my kids because I grew up in a household where my dad worked a lot. He was self-employed, so he was constantly running around. It's not to say he wasn't involved. He was very involved. But my mom was the disciplinarian, and she just ran a tight ship. And that's how, much like you and your mom, that's how I was raising my kids. And my wife grew up differently. She had a little more flexibility. What I'm getting at is you have to respect each other in the marriage and respect your backgrounds and respect your upbringings and find that mix, right? Because it's not just you had kids and now we're going to raise them to my values or her values. We're going to raise them to our values. We made a vow to come together as a as an entity, a married entity. And part of that, when kids are in the picture, is that you have to figure out what your collective values are. And the only way you can do that is having that relationship and talking about things and really kind of driving it home. Because if we're just each on an island, we're going to confuse the hell out of our kids, and we're going to constantly be battling about whether my way is right or your way is right. And the kids are just going to pick and choose the parts of each that they like, and it's just going to be chaos.
I love that concept of collective values, because that's what it boils down to, is you're never going to have collective values. You're never going to have a unified front. You're never going to be coming from the same place if you can't prioritize her.
Right.
If you can't have a great relationship with her. If you can't come home and the first thing you do when you get in the door is give your wife a kiss or hug or ask her how her day was or whatever that looks like, so that she knows that she's valued, that she's important. Ultimately, so many marriages that struggle and ultimately fail is due in large part to a lack of communication. That unified collective front doesn't exist because that prioritization doesn't exist. If one party in a marriage doesn't feel prioritized or feel as if they're important, it's very hard for that marriage to become tenable, because they feel unimportant, they feel devalued, and that's not why we're here. Men, I will go as far as to say it is a requirement of a man. It is a duty of a man to ensure that he has a good marriage with his wife. And that means prioritizing her and loving her unconditionally. And as you do that, as you put your woman first, everything else in your life will fall into place on the home front. If you prioritize your wife, if you communicate with her, your kids will see that, they'll recognize that, and they'll respect that. Other people will respect that as well. But most importantly, and I think one thing that we haven't necessarily gotten into a ton, is just how much that's going to mean to her. Of course, that means a lot to your kids. But at the end of the day, it needs to matter to her. She needs to feel valued and important. And as that happens, that will ensure that everything else falls into place. Mm-hmm. So I guess where I'm going with this is it's up to us to prioritize our wives and to make sure that they know unconditionally, without question, that we love them and that they are our priority. And as we do that, all these things about creating a unified front becomes that much easier, because she knows that we're in her corner. She knows that we've got her back, and then we can just go from there.
So when your wife hits you with that kind of right hook that, your daughter is more important to you than anyone else in this family, and you kind of, you took that step back and was winded by that one. What were some of the steps that you took, and how can guys who are in similar situations start to turn things around?
Okay, that's a good question. So when that was posited to me, when I heard that, we were seeing a therapist. We had not had a great relationship for a long time. We were roommates rather than partners or spouses, as my wife would say. So I was scared. I'd gotten my relationship to a point with my wife where it was very transactional when we would speak. It's hard to talk about life and fears and pains and funny things and enjoy each other's company because we hadn't done it in such a long time. So the way that had to start is a realization and a recognition, looking myself in the mirror and saying, this isn't what I want for myself. This isn't what I want for my kids. And this isn't what I want for my wife. So it was eating a little bit of humble pie and recognizing that it's not incumbent on her to fix this. It's not incumbent on anybody else to correct this. It's on me. If our marriage is going to get right, and if we're going to have a unified front, if we're going to have a great foundation, this has to start with me. So most people who know me know that I'm pretty conversational. I can generally talk to just about anybody, but I was petrified of talking to my wife. We'd gotten to that sort of point where talking was hard. So step one was talking to her, coming home, asking how her day was. And if she might not have chosen to engage on certain days, that was okay. Step two was making sure that she felt important. There are a couple ways that I went about doing that. We took the love languages test so I could find out what sorts of things that really would resonate with her to help her feel connected. And then I spent time applying those things. Like, she really needs words of affirmation. Mm-hmm. Like those are very critical to her. So I made sure to leave her little post-it notes or send her a text, little things like that. And it was hard at first. It felt awkward at first, but I would do those things so that she felt important. She also is really big on acts of service. So I historically have always struggled with washing dishes. I do a crappy job. I'm not very thorough. I would then start to wash some dishes and say, hey, I wanted to do some dishes. I'm setting them here so you can look at them to make sure that they're up to snuff. Things like that. Small steps and not expecting anything in return. I know that some guys who are listening to this are kind of like me, where you're a quote unquote nice guy. Nice guys give to get. So in other words, you do something with the expectation you're going to get something in return. I'm going to do the dishes because I'm going to get sex, or I'm going to ask her how her day was so that she gives me a hug and tells me how awesome I am. I had to learn to push past that and say, I'm not doing these things with any sort of expectation of anything in return. I'm doing them to help her feel that she's important and that she's validated. And it got a little easier, and it got a little easier, and it got a little easier. It's just like any conversation that we've had about going to the gym or building habits. These first few times suck, but over time it got easier and easier to come home and say, hey, how's your day? How are the kids? Did our son do anything to drive you crazy today? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do these dishes. I was thinking about you. I brought you home this cookie, whatever it is. And I noticed that as I did those things, one, my wife started letting her guard down a little bit. We started to have a unified front once again. And two, and most importantly, is she began to feel comfortable and feel that we were on the same page. Mm-hmm. And another thing that I saw from all of that is how much my kids respected it. That all the things that I wanted to work on as a father fell into line because they saw that they had parents who loved each other and cared about each other. So was it easy? No. But at the same time, did I do anything earth-shattering? No. I didn't do anything that would be hard for any man to apply. It's just simply pushing past fear, doing something that's uncomfortable, and being relentless in the pursuit of executing on it.
Yep. You hit on something that we've hit on before, but the idea of performing an act and expecting nothing in return. You're building that foundation, or restoring that foundation, I'll say. Because I imagine it was there at some point in the beginning when you were married before kids, right? Yeah. But rebuilding that foundation and putting the deposits in to do that is so critical. I had a similar experience to you. It's when we kind of hit that point where we realized we were basically just roommates with kids. It was, what can I do to serve her? So my wife was working, so we were both, busy. She works out of the house now. She was not working out of the house at the time. So we were both leaving in the morning, coming back. Little things like we live in more of a, I'll call it, gender role traditional house where she makes dinner most of the time, that kind of thing. So I picked up making dinner a couple nights a week. Stupid stuff like, no, I shouldn't say stupid, but stuff like you talked about where I would bring home flowers randomly for no reason. I would, just give her a text in the middle of the day, just, hey, thinking about you, that kind of stuff. And we also made a point to, and this is a big one that I think a lot of guys fall down on. I took initiative and got the number of the babysitter that we had at the time, scheduled her for 1 weekend a month for 3 months in a row. And I made plans to go out. And I said, we're going out, we're having a date night. Very easy thing to do, but just the fact that I took the initiative and I picked restaurants or picked a movie or whatever, she was just like, it was basically back to, we're dating again. And I feel loved and appreciated, and I feel like he cares, and that I'm not just the woman who takes care of his children and cleans his house and cooks his meals. It's just, I think that, and I don't want to speak for her, but I think that really changed her mindset into how she viewed me, and how I know it changed how our relationship was. Because when we went out, we were able to have those discussions that maybe sometimes it's hard to do when there's 2 4-year-olds running around terrorizing the house. And we were able to appreciate each other's company. And then as time's gone on and the kids have grown up a little bit, now we can go out much more readily without them. They're in middle school and can stay home by themselves and usually have a better social life than us at this point. But but we can also we've started to go away for 2 or 3 days on the weekends, leaving the kids with my in-laws or friends, and that has turned our relationship around. We're very much back to where we were before kids in terms of how we relate to one another. And you're right, it's my kids see it. My kids absolutely appreciate the fact that mom and dad are on the same page. Because listen, they're at an age right now where a lot of their friends' parents are getting divorced. I mean, COVID was they either drew you together, pulled you apart. So there's a lot of people going through that. They've each got at least 2 or 3 close friends whose parents are splitting up for one reason or another, and they see us coming together, and I think that's really important to them. And it's because I prioritize that time with my wife. And again, I want to be adamant in this. It is not about doing it at the expense of being a father or at the expense of your children. But if push comes to shove, and I've told my kids this outright, when they were little, they didn't understand it. They're starting to understand it now. That my wife, I'll tell my girls, she is more important to me than you are. And that sounds really harsh and that sounds really nasty to say, but they understand it now in what I'm saying to them. That relationship is a relationship that I plan to have until the day they put me in the ground. And I'll have a relationship with you until the day they put me in the ground. But I will be living with this woman and spending the rest of my life, sharing my life with her. You're going to go on and do great things and leave this house and be an incredible person. But she is not. And it is important to me that we have as strong of a relationship as we can together now, so that when you are gone and doing those excellent things, we will be able to have that excellent relationship without you here. Because the kids provide a buffer that you don't even realize at certain points. And once they're removed, I've seen it. We're in that stage of life now where some of the parents that we hang out with have older kids, and they're starting to get that empty nest syndrome, and they're just like, I don't know this person. I don't, we live together, but we don't know each other. And I want to avoid that like the plague. It scares me.
What sort of incredible example, is that setting for your daughters? That here you are, your priority is your wife. That's telling them, that's sending a clear message to them.
Absolutely.
That's exactly what they want someday.
That's absolutely part of it, too.
To do that exact same thing.
It is not why I do it. I do it for the sincere reason that I want that relationship for my wife.
Right.
But don't think for a minute that I don't realize I am imprinting that expectation in my daughters for what a man in their life should be like.
Yeah, exactly. They see you taking, your wife on dates, taking her out for the weekend. Yeah. That's going to the bar has been set. They now know the type of man they're going to look for someday because they see it every day.
And this is a little off topic too, but I treat my daughters that way too when we're alone, right? And that sounds a little fishy, but like, for instance, I took my daughter up to Massachusetts this weekend. It was my niece's first communion. From the time we left the house until the time we get back, my daughter was my top priority. Not only because she's my daughter and I have to be there to protect her, but she was the person I was with, and she was the person, I gave her my attention. And part of it is, this was my chance to build the relationship with her because everything else is absent. And it's also a chance for me to set that expectation of, this is how you deserve to be treated. And this is how you should expect to be treated. She also saw me checking in with her mom every night to make sure that I was still keeping that relationship strong.
Coming back full circle, I think one thing that is so easy to forget, especially when you have kids, especially young kids, is to date your wife. Yeah. Make time, go to dinner, go to a movie, go to some art class, something where it's just you and her. It will absolutely mean the world to her. There's one thing that I've had to learn how to do again is to date my wife. Mm-hmm. And the results have been incredible, just as you said. And two, I too, there are a lot of traditional gender roles at our house, as I'm sure there are for most men listening to this, despite what the world tries to tell us. Make dinner at least once a week. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying throw some hot dogs on a grill. I'm saying if you actually make a good meal for your family. Yeah, it's easy to make the excuse of, I worked today, I'm tired, I just want to go home and sit on the couch and have a nice hot meal. If any of you have ever had the opportunity to spend a day with your kids, realize just how incredibly exhausting it is for our wives. Kids, awesome and wonderful, are exhausting. You spend the time to make your wife a nice meal, after a hard day at work, it's going to mean everything to her.
Yep.
You date her, if you let her know that she's valued, and I do that by trying to make meals, like make stuff that isn't crap. They see that and they appreciate that. And that is exactly what Dan was saying, is as you do those things, that relationship can get back to exactly where it was when you first started dating, when you first got married. And that's the most important thing, is that's the relationship that matters. That's the relationship that you committed yourself to. You committed yourself to this woman and you made promises to her before God that you would treat her and esteem her in a certain way. It's really important to get back to that. It's vitally important to get back to that.
Yeah, I could not have said that better myself. And for the single guys who are listening to this, who are just trying to take notes for the future, learn how to cook. It will impress the ladies very much.
Yeah, and it's not nearly as hard as you think.
And you won't be eating ramen or bologna on hand for.
Yeah, it's not nearly as. I was so intimidated by cooking, but man, it's not that bad.
No, it's great. And you know what? Like, I mean, you're probably experiencing this with the kids, right now with the ages they're at. But it gets fun too because they want to get involved, right? Especially, if mom's cooking, that's something that probably is happening all the time. It's not so special. But if dad's cooking, that's something different, and they want to jump in. It's a great way to bond with them. I was teaching my daughter how to make penne alla vodka when she was like 5 years old, and she was cooking. She was chopping up onions and stuff like that at a young age, and they just like spending that time with you. So it's a great way to bond with your kids. It's a great way to give your wife a break and show that you appreciate her. It's just win-win-win all the way around, in my opinion.
Big facts. Cool. All right, Dan. Really good topic. I think from a tactical perspective, just to recap for you men out there, let's put our women first. And that means in a lot of ways, we almost have to romance them again, date them, let them know that they're appreciated, prioritize them. And as you do those things, we listed a lot of things: taking them on dates, cooking dinner, doing errands, bring home flowers, whatever speaks to her and resonates with her, do it. Your kids will appreciate it. Your kids are going to look back 20 years from now, say, man, I remember just how much my dad loved my mom. And that set up the foundation for my life. Those are the types of men that we should be. We all have heard stories of these incredible, beautiful romances and the impacts that they made on their families. We can have that. And ultimately we should.
Yep. I don't have much to add to that other than, Brad said it really well. He gave a lot of good examples of what to do. The bottom line is take initiative. Take the initiative. Show that you are willing to put in the work and you're willing to make the plans and do the work to make sure that she is your priority. That's all I got.
That's it. That's all she wrote.
Well, yeah, great conversation. I really like where this went. I really like, I think you and I have very similar thoughts on this. And I think it's also very, very important that guys hear this kind of stuff, right? It is not the rough and tumble, sexy, masculine thing that you think of, but on the home front, it is so important to make sure that relationship is strong and to make sure that you are being the best man you can be inside the walls of your home. Because if you can't take care of your home and you can't get that squared away, I mean, everything else falls apart and doesn't matter. You need to take care of your house first before you take care of anything else outside of those four walls. And it starts with the relationship with your wife. We appreciate everyone listening. What you can do to help us out is to go to your podcast player of choice and leave us a 5-star rating and review. We've had a couple of those trickling in. They really do help us get the word out. We want to start getting more so that we get more exposure. If you have done that, great. Thank you. Send it our way. Let us know. You can find our contact information on the website, untamingmasculinity.com. You'll find links to all of our social media platforms there, as well as little write-ups on the individual episodes. Brad, great conversation again. We will talk to you all next week.